Hello, everyone. Good morning. Hopefully you can hear and see me all right. Just let me know in the comments here if that's not the case. Hi, my name is Paul Buffa, and today I'll be walking through our Observable Overview workshop. So if you're new to Observable, you want to learn the basics of how to get up and running, or maybe you've played around with it a little bit before, this is going to be a good workshop for you. So today we're going to try to cover kind of all the first level stuff you need to know to get started in Observable, adding data, building visualizations, sharing work and things like that. So really excited for today. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put it in here. I'll be checking the comments as we go along. So happy to pause at any point and go through that with you. For today, I think it's always great if you can try to follow along a bit and work in a notebook as I go through it to help, solidify what we're teaching. So if you don't have an Observable account yet, I would sign up now and get a notebook open. I'll walk through how to do that in a little bit if you don't know how to open a new notebook. So you can kind of follow along and see what we're doing. Of course, though, if you'd rather just kind of watch and see how this all works and just hang out, totally fine too. Hopefully, either way, you'll get a lot out of this. So why don't we jump right in here? So I've got open right now an Observable notebook. And again, if you want to, in the next minute or so, sign up while I walk through this. I'll kind of just do a kind of a quick overview, then we'll go into like everything. So why don't we just start off with really quick overview of how you can start and build in Observable. So I'm going to just do like a 1-minute demo of how you can add in data and wrangle it and start visualizing it. So I've got a local file here. I'm just going to literally copy and paste into this notebook. Here we go. Or I'll just drag it in here. I'd open up my file attachments pane, and I've added this data set called mta.csv. It's from the New York City MTA Transit Authority, which runs the subways and the buses and the railroads. So it's data around how many people take the subways and the buses. I can add this to my notebook by clicking on this little insert into notebook icon. And there we go. I've got my data loaded in here. And I can see the sort of spreadsheet view of it. I can see the different columns and rows and the different values. I get these nice little, distribution charts at the top to understand the shape of my data and what it looks like. So I can see, whether it's got a normal distribution or a uniform distribution. And I can use this right away to start visualizing it. So it's called this data set MTA. I can add a new cell underneath and create a chart. Select my different options here. So maybe I'll do something like date, and then this subway's total estimated ridership, and maybe bump out the margin a little bit here. It looks a little cut off on the left side. There you go. I've got a chart built off a local CSV file I've added to my notebook in about 1 minute, right? We're able to visualize it. So we'll go through all this in more depth throughout this course today, but that's essentially what we're going to try to have at the end of this workshop is everyone knows how to do something like this. You can add data to a notebook, visualize it quickly, and start building out your analysis. So what is a notebook? If you've worked with other notebook platforms before, Observable is very similar. A notebook, it's sort of the main entity in which we do all of our work in Observable. We create new notebooks by clicking on the plus icon up in the top right-hand corner next to your avatar. And there, you'll have the option to build out a new notebook, either from a template or just one from scratch. Oh, yes. Sorry. Someone's saying my face is in the way. Let me just adjust that real quick. Here we go. Let me move this around. And I think actually it looks like if I look at the recording here, the top of this is getting a little bit cut off. So let me see if I can just nudge this down a bit, and maybe that'll help. Yeah, there we go. Okay. It looks like it was cutting off actually maybe the top portion of my notebook, so you couldn't see the button I was clicking on. Let me just adjust this a little bit. And here we go. I think now I can see exactly what you're seeing. All right, much better. That should maybe a little bit more on the bottom here because I think it's still getting a little cut off. Yeah, you can start to see that little menu at the bottom that has some options. Okay, great. And move this over. Perfect. All right, hopefully that's a lot better. But please feel free to let me know if still could be a little improved. All right, great. Thank you. So I clicked on this plus button up here. You won't see my cursor when I'm sharing my screen, but you can hopefully see when I'm hovering over something, kind of highlights it. There's this new button right here. I click on that, create a new notebook. And that's how I get started. So notebooks, when we do our work in Observable, they're comprised of cells. So when you're working in a notebook, you add cells to it to do your analysis. So I started this off with that quick demo before by adding this cell that pulled in my data set and showed it visually. I can add a new cell to my notebook by clicking on this plus button anywhere within the notebook. So you'll see it's kind of hidden until you hover over that section in the notebook, and you'll see there's a plus button there. So I'll click on that, and then I'll see all the options for the different cells that we have. Oh, it looks like someone's calling from Colorado. Very nice. I'm in Colorado myself. I'm up in Boulder. In Observable, we've got a bunch of different types of cells you can add to notebooks. The main ones being these three at the top here: JavaScript, Markdown, and HTML. We do a lot of work in JavaScript in Observable, given we're all online in the browser. There's no setup or installation required. So we do a lot of work in JavaScript, and it works great for data visualization. Markdown for text and HTML if you want to add HTML to it. We call these different cells, like cell modes. So it's the mode in which you're working in. It's kind of the language you work in. So we've got kind of these 3 high-level cell modes. And then we have a lot more things in here that are sort of specialty cells for working with either data sets or building out visualizations. So this next series here of cells are different ways you can add data to your notebook. So I covered one already with the file attachment. You can do it here, or you can click on the little file attachment pane there, which allows you to upload a local file. Oh, nice, and Longmont, very cool. So you can do really any type of file you like for this. Often people use something like a CSV or a JSON file. But you can also upload Excel files, so XLSX. It was a little bit of a mouthful. You can add GeoJSON files, shape files, zip files. Really, pretty much any file type is going to be supported. You'll have to, for maybe uncommon file types, figure out a way to handle it, to parse that data out. But for the common file types, it's very easy. Like CSV and JSON kind of automatically knows how to work with that. There is a limit to how large your files can be. So in notebooks, there's a 50 megabyte limit. So if you've got a really, really large file, you're going to probably want to figure out another way to add that in. 50 megabytes is pretty big, and that's for each file. So you could have like 4 files that are 49.9 megabytes, and that's going to be all right. But there is a file limit. So usually a suggestion, if it's that large, you might want to try a different option, which is something like a cloud file. So you could pull in data from the cloud. You could do it from a Google Drive account or a Microsoft Teams account. You could also do it through an API. So if you have an API endpoint you can hit, that's a great way to pull data into your notebook. That's a really fun one I like too, because if the API is updating, every time you load your notebook, that data will refresh and update. So that's pretty fun. And then also you can use database. You can connect to remote databases, and you can also run databases in a notebook without connecting to a remote database, which I think we'll cover a little bit more later of how that works. It's a pretty cool feature of observable notebooks around running kind of databases on the fly. So lots of different ways you can add data to your notebook. So we've got these different cells, we've got these different cell types, and cells kind of work together when you're analysis, right? So you saw before when I was pulling this data set on the MTA, I had this one cell that was just looking at the data. It was giving me this sort of spreadsheet view and some summary charts at the top. And then I used that data in another cell, right? I used it when I was building this chart. I connected to the data in this dropdown here, and then I was able to visualize it. So cells can talk to each other, right? Again, similar to other notebook platforms. When you define a cell, you can reference that in other cells. So I can do a really super basic example of this. Let me create a new JavaScript cell. I'll say something like A equals 10. We can build another one and do B equals 20. And then we can have another last cell that's A plus B. Right? So these two cells, feed this last cell here, right? So there's a dependency for this cell to have B and A defined. So you can actually see these sort of dependency trees in an observable notebook, which is a great way when you're maybe trying to debug something or understand how a notebook works. You can pull up this thing called the mini map, which is on the right-hand side here. And you can see these dependency trees. So I can see that this cell I'm on right now, the one that's A plus B, is dependent on A and B. So we call this like the reactive data flow. So when you make changes to your notebook, it's going to update these dependencies that exist among cells. So if I update the value of A, it's going to update automatically this cell which uses A. So if I change A to 15, you'll see that the result is now 35. Now this actually is different than some other notebook platforms. So say, for example, like a Jupyter notebook, which is used for more Python work. You have to run that notebook in a specific order. So if you change something in an earlier cell where there's a dependency, it won't actually update in that notebook. You have to make sure to rerun everything. With an observable notebook, those changes happen automatically. So when I change the value of this cell, it's automatically going to update this one down here. And it's an important thing to note because you don't have to worry about rerunning your notebook, right? You can just make a change where it's needed and everything else will update. And only those things that need that update. So you'll notice if I change the value of A here, see it like real quickly. There's a little like little animation that basically happens along the side of the cell. There's like a little gray bar that appears and disappears, right? You can do it again. You can see there it is, there, and it's gone. It's only that little animation shows you what cells are running, and it's only running the ones that need to run. So A is running, so it means the one that uses A is also running. This cell here that doesn't use the prior one, the A value, doesn't update, doesn't change at all. So when I rerun this, that one doesn't get that little animation, right? It's not rerunning that cell. So it's going to figure out what these dependencies are and only run the ones that it needs to run. So important concept again. And if you ever want to see those dependencies, you can kind of see it this way. There's a little bit of like a grammar here you can see in these trees where it shows that like if there's a dependency, it kind of makes the node appear to the left, right? If I did the opposite here, you'll see if I hovered on this cell, it shows what's kind of further downstream. So it'll show me that, oh, this other cell beneath me, it uses this value. So the dependency, the little graph, right, it goes in the opposite direction. And this can get complicated if you've got dependencies on dependencies on dependencies, a really large notebook. So really nice to have this. When you're working with cells, you can keep adding them to your notebook, but at some point you might want to edit that a bit to make it more presentable or something like that, right? So you might be working in here, but then at some point you want to share this with somebody to get their feedback or get some input. So there's lots of ways you can kind of edit and rearrange cells to make them more presentable. So you can close cells to hide their code. So by default, all JavaScript cells are going to be pinned open. So you see the code underneath. We often believe that's a good practice. So that's why we make the default setting. We want people to be able to explore the code and see how things work, be able to get under the hood and no smoke and mirrors, right? But you can always close that, right? If you're doing a presentation, maybe you just want to hide that code there. You only want to show the result. So if you click on that pin, it'll just hide the code for you. You can see there's an option down here as well to kind of close the pin. So if you do that, if you run that cell, it'll automatically close. You can also move cells around in your notebook. So I can just click and drag this cell to move it around. So if I want to just kind of change the order in which something appears, and maybe I want this chart to be the first thing in my notebook, I can just click and drag this around, and now my chart's at the top of the notebook. One of my favorite features I use a lot in notebooks is the ability to duplicate cells. So, maybe I'm working on this chart. I'm like, this one's cool, but I might want to change it a little bit. I want to tweak it and see what else I can find, in my results. But I want to keep this copy. There's a little button down here for duplicating cells. This icon with a little plus button next to the trash one. If I click on that, it's going to make a copy of my cell right underneath and allow me to keep kind of both versions. So now maybe this one I'll look at bus ridership levels in the New York City. By the way, this data is pretty interesting. It's daily ridership levels for different methods of transportation. And it's like right before COVID first happened in New York City in March of 2020 until I think this data goes to like October of 2022. So you can see like it jumps down and kind of slowly ramps back up. Pretty interesting data set to work with. So moving cells around, hiding, showing code, duplicating cells, all of that can be really effective. You can also select multiple cells at once if you want to move around a bunch. So if I clicked on this one, and I said I want to move this one around, there's this little check button down here. So I can select this cell. You'll notice once I do that, there's an option to select more. So I can select another cell and this cell. And now I can either drag them around as a group, or I can click on these move buttons down here to move them up or down. So lots of different ways to kind of, add or remove cells. You can obviously delete cells as well. I will note though, once you delete a cell, it's kind of gone, right? So be careful with deleting cells. Although another neat feature about notebooks is that when you make changes, your history is saved. So this is also one of my favorite features about observable notebooks is that you can kind of, feel all right if you make changes and break something because you can always revert back to an earlier version. You'll notice over here, so I've got a bunch of different panes here. We talked about the file attachment one. We talked about this mini map. There's also this one with the little clock icon called the history pane. And if I click on that, I can see the history of all the changes that happened in my notebook. So I can go back all the way to the first thing I did, which is I created a notebook and it had nothing in it, right? You'll notice at the top here, it's going to say restore back to version 2 of 50. So I can see the actual version of every change I made. So that's every time I like updated a cell, ran a cell, added a cell, something like that. And I can go back if I want to. So it's a pretty nice uh, feature to have. So if you're making changes and you broke something, you can always get back and you can compare to as well to see what changed. Actually, I should maybe just walk through that real quick. So if I go back to, say, this version here, there's a little icon that'll pop up on the side. There you go. That allows me to compare these versions. So I can actually compare and see, oh, what was the thing that was changed? So, here I added this new title. So it's cool. You can actually also just see what those changes are explicitly rather than having to kind of compare by just going through different versions. Oops, went back a little too far. Here we go. So yeah, lots and lots of different ways to work with cells and notebooks. Let me just take a quick check to see if there's any questions in the chat. I also get a sip of orange juice. All right. So I talked about some different ways that you can add data to notebooks. Again, file attachments, cloud files. File attachments is easy. You can just like literally drag and drop. You also can click on this and it'll look, pull up a window for files on your computer. For cloud files, you have to attach, you have to sign in to one of your like Google Drive or Microsoft Teams accounts to be able to access those files and have that there. The other one here is for databases. So within your settings on your account, so when you sign up for Observable, you have like a user, and then you've got a workspace. And the workspace is where you do your work, right? That's where you add notebooks. That is where you're going to be setting your workspace permissions and things like that if you want to add other people to your workspace. And there you'll also define database connections. So you can connect to lots and lots of different types of databases, pretty much all the standard databases you would expect, like Postgres, MySQL, Snowflake, BigQuery, any of those types. And you'll have to just do the kind of standard, giving in your connection details. And once you have those set up, you'll be able to pull those into any notebook. So when you go here, database connections, you click on this plus button, and you'll see all the options for the different types of databases that you have. So, I think, let me check. I think this is a good one to demo. We'll pull this one in here. Yeah, so here's like a demo database. And once I've added that to my notebook, I can click on that to see the schema overview. So I can see what the tables are in my database. I can see specific values as well. So I can click on one of these tables and I can see exactly what information is in there. This, by the way, is just a mock data set that we built out for demos. So it's about a pizzeria franchise. It's got customers and pizza orders and what items they were ordered, etc. It looks like a few questions have come in. So let me just take a quick look here. So is the history being stored through Git? Actually, I'm not sure if it's using Git per se. I mean, essentially, it's going to store a record in a database that we're pulling up. So I don't think it's actually using Git. It's got that sort of GitHub look to the way you can reference earlier versions and do those like comparisons and pull requests and things like that. But I don't believe it's actually using Git here. So another one here. Let's see. No, yeah. So if you export this notebook, it's not going to already initialize a GitHub repo. No. Hopefully that answers all your questions. So once I've pulled in a database in here and I've got my connection added, it actually automatically added this cell for me. And this is another one of our cell types. So I talked before about JavaScript, HTML, and Markdown. This is the SQL cell. So I can run SQL inside of my notebook, which again is pretty cool because you can kind of just run SQL alongside JavaScript and Markdown HTML. So I could do something like a select star from let's say stores, all the stores in the database, and I've now got those results live alongside in my notebook. And you can just run any type of SQL here. So this is going to work for really all the major SQL dialects. And when you're working with SQL in Observable, unlike some other BI tools where you might have to learn some special version of SQL, right? This is just going to be whatever SQL dialect it is that you're working in. So if you pull in a Snowflake instance, you can write Snowflake queries. If you're pulling in a Postgres instance, you can write Postgres queries. So that's always really nice because different SQL dialects have really specific functions that you can use that are pretty powerful. Like we use a lot of Snowflake here. We use a lot of DuckDB as well. They have some really great functions for working in it. So it's great that I can use those within a notebook and I don't have to learn some observable SQL or something like that. So that's pretty neat. Another thing I mentioned before was the fact that you can also run databases on the fly. One thing I should note, for connecting to remote databases, you would need a pro or an enterprise account. So it's not part of our free offering, but there is a way to connect to databases in free, but it's just not connecting to a remote database. And that's using something called DuckDB. So DuckDB is a pretty cool framework for working in SQL. There's a JavaScript client that allows you to basically build SQL databases on the fly. So I can just take any sort of data structure and convert it into a SQL database and start working with that. And we kind of added this throughout Observable under the hood. So you always have that option when you're working with a data set. So before I added this MTA data, right? It's up. I made a copy. Here we are. So here's the MTA data. I pulled it in from a CSV, but if I wanted to, yeah, sorry, you're not gonna be able to see my cursor. It's just a screen share thing. That's always a little tricky, but hopefully you can see when I'm hovering over something. So, before I pulled in the CSV file, I looked at it using a data table cell. So this is a cell, again, for kind of just viewing data and doing some basic data wrangling, like filtering or sorting or slicing. I could actually just treat this MTA data, which again was a CSV file, as a SQL database if I like. So if I add a new SQL cell, I'm going to click on the new plus button here, search for SQL. Another kind of neat little feature you didn't maybe need to notice, I can type into this cell menu and just filter the options, which is nice. So I'll click on SQL, and it's now connecting to my CSV file, and I can now write SQL against that. I don't even think I need that quote there, right, MTA. So if I wanted to, I could say, all right, I want to pull in the dates, and I'm going to pull in this value here. I think it's called subways. Yeah, total estimated ridership. And I'm just going to call that as value. And I can order by date. Maybe we do it ascending. I think it's actually default descending. And there you go. So now I'm just writing SQL against a CSV. So, if you like writing SQL, I know a lot of people kind of don't know SQL or maybe don't love writing in SQL. I really enjoy SQL. It's a great option for you. I do think it's really effective when you are working with a bunch of different files and you want to do some simple joins. So you want to connect a few different files together to make one kind of aggregate view. SQL is really good for that. It's actually often hard to do that with something like JavaScript or Python or R. SQL is perfect for just combining a few small files together. So it's a pretty cool option. To do that, just to note, if you want to make a database with multiple different tables, you do have to just declare that. So you could open up a new JavaScript cell, call it my database, and call this DuckDB, which is part of our standard library. So if I do that, it automatically just gives me the code. I just hit tab, it kind of finishes it for me. And then anything I put in here will become a table in my database. So I can call MTA as one of the tables. If I had more, I could add more there as well. So pretty cool way you can work with lots of data in a notebook without having to connect to a remote server. And this will work with anything, right? So it works with CSV files. It could work with an API endpoint if you want to convert an API endpoint into a database. We also use a lot of Parquet files. Parquet files are pretty cool. So it's a way to really condense CSVs in a much smaller file size. So if you do have like a 100 megabyte CSV you want to add to a notebook, it kind of goes past our file attachments limit. You can convert it to a Parquet file and then add that and just use that as if you were using a CSV. So that's pretty nice. There's a helper for that. If you just look for CSV to Parquet in Observable, you'll find one that kind of does that for you. I want to also just quickly walk through a little bit more detail this data table cell I mentioned before. So if you don't want to write any code for working with your data set, you just want to be able to mess around with it a little bit, do some simple manipulation, some coercion, things like that. The data table cell is a great option for you. So you notice here, by default, when you add a data set, it's going to add a data table cell for you, so you can get that kind of quick look in there, and I kind of showed you just a little bit about it, but let me go into a little bit more depth. So, you're going to get this spreadsheet view by default of your data set. Depending on how large your data set is, it may show you all the records, or it may just give you a sample of the records, because, if it's a million records long, it might be a little bit slow to load all those in and visualize them. So, you can kind of see in the bottom right-hand corner here, if it is doing a sample or if it's pulling in all the records, it'll say it's like sampling a certain amount. You can specify that if you like, so you can actually slice a section of the data. So if I want to just do it to the first, 100 rows, I could add that in here. So if you want to just, pick a little piece of it and work with that, that also works well. For now, since it's not that large of a data set, I'll leave the whole thing open. And you can work and manipulate the data set down here with all these options. So you can sort the data based on different column values. I can do it by dates, maybe ascending instead of descending. You can see it updates right there. I can select specific columns. Maybe I only want to look at these, first couple here. So I'll select only that. And then I'll do, date and the buses. It actually even changes the order of it, which is kind of cool. I think I can just drag that. Maybe not. Maybe I have to do it specific order down here. There we go. I can filter based on each of these values here. So maybe I want to do something where the subways had over 1 million riders a day. There you go. And now I can filter those results. So lots of different ways you can work with this, right? You can also rename columns up here, which is nice. So if you just want to change this, it's got like a long column name. I can change just to buses. I can just change this to subways. And now my columns are updated. You'll notice actually my chart now is a little broken because it's referencing a column doesn't exist anymore. So I'd have to just update that real quick. Subways here. It looks a little funky now too because I also filtered for certain days, like days that are over 1 million. I think if I took that off, it'll look nice again. Here we go. There you go. See. Another neat feature that has just come out recently is the ability to derive values from different columns. So if I click on this little plus button up here, I can now start adding new columns to my data set based on a simple function. So this is similar to Excel, where you can just write a little basic function and apply that to your data set to add a new column. So say I want to reference the subways. If I just ran this, I'll just pull obviously the subway value. Not that exciting here. What was it? An expression. If I want to do something like, this is a very, I don't know why you necessarily want to do this, but if you want to just divide it by 1,000, right? Divide all the values by 1,000, in units of 1,000, I can do that, and it changes the values here. So you can do any JavaScript you want in there. Just basic, algebra. You can pull in a custom function and use that as well. But it's a nice way, again, if you want to work with the data, you don't want to necessarily have to write everything out in JavaScript. You can use the data table cell or do everything in SQL. That's another good option too. This is a great version for you. So you can do that work and then reference that throughout, right? And same thing, you can change the name here, my new. You'll also notice last part is that it automatically tries to detect the type of data you have here. So it says this looks like a date column. So let's make these dates. A lot of times when you add data, from these files, it's like by default they're all just treated like text. They're treated like string. So you kind of have to handle for that. You have to say, oh no, this is a number and this is a date. It'll automatically try to do that for you as best it can. But you can always override that. So these drop downs here allow me to change that to a string if I wanted to. That's going to make my chart look really weird because now it's like, okay, I guess we're drawing strings over time or something. Dates are going to work a lot better. It knows how to handle dates and correctly show the tick marks. But yeah, you can always override that as well. All right. So I talked very briefly about this chart cell here. Let's go into that also in a little bit more depth. Just one second. So the chart cell, it's a newer cell that we started working with. I think it came out a few months ago now, maybe 3 or 4 months ago. So this is a no code way or starting to visualize data in a notebook. Before, you had to always write a little bit of code, although often it was pretty simple to start visualizing your data in a notebook. But now there's an option to not write any code at all, just use the chart cell. So what the chart cell does is it has some logic built into it where it'll try to figure out how to best visualize your data given the least number of parameters. So let me make a new one actually here. So I'll click down here. You'll notice if I've got a data set in my notebook in a cell right above, it'll give me a suggestion to add a chart to the notebook using chart cell. You can get it that way. If it's not there though, you can also just search for chart. And you'll see there's another option for create chart. All right, so when I do that though, it will automatically connect to that data set that's in the cell above. I could override that if I wanted to and select a different option here, but for this one, I'm just working with this one data set, so I'll leave that there. And if I just specify one of these different parameters here, only need one, it'll automatically start to visualize that data. So if I just did date, it builds me a bar chart. And what this is doing, it's doing a little aggregation for me, right? It's trying to count the number of records by time, like by dates, and it's grouping those dates here into months, right? Or actually, I think this is quarters. It's grouping into quarters. So chart cell, it's a little bit smart, right? It tries to figure out, given your data, how might you want to visualize this? I can override that though by changing a value here. So I change the buses. It's going to now draw a line chart with all the values over time. And again, it changed the mark, right? It went from being a bar chart to a line chart because it knows, all right, if you're looking at one single metric over time, a line chart might be better for you than a bar chart. And I can override that if I like. And I say, no, I really want a bar chart. Actually, here, I think this is a good little catch. Sometimes you got to be careful with bars because it will by default have a little padding, right? There's a little padding in between the bars. And so if there's so many bars, it's going to like disappear because there's too much padding and it kind of hides the bars. I can just change that by putting an area chart. But that is one little gotcha you got to be kind of careful for when you're doing bar charts with lots of values. But yeah, you can override those values, right? I can change them here. Also, I noted before, like the y-axis was getting a little cut off because now I've got a pretty large number there. I can change that by clicking on this customize button. So here I can change a lot of the formatting options for my chart cell. So I can change the margin here, bump that out to 100. This one here doesn't have a legend given it's just one metric that we're looking at a time. But I could change the options for metrics. I could change the option for the X label, would be like, bus ridership, something like that, and now it's going to update that in my chart. So lots of ways to do that. Also gives me kind of a tooltip by default. So pretty cool. There's lots of different options here. Definitely recommend playing around with them a little bit. Some make more sense than others depending on the data set. So I could change the color based on one of the values in my data set. So now I did add a legend, right? Because now it's trying to explain what those colors mean. Here, it's kind of like a double encoding. So even though the height of the area indicates how many people are on the buses, I'm also using the color of that section to indicate how many people are on the buses. So sort of like a double encoding. I can do something like maybe do a scatter plot. So if I did subways, and whoa, it's crazy because it's like checked off as an area. Let's make this a dot. So here we go. So now I've got a scatter plot view. I can take off that color for now. I can also update the size of these marks based on the value. So here it's comparing the relationship between subway ridership and buses ridership. There's clearly somewhat of a positive correlation. Days when people ride the buses more, they also ride the subways more. I can change the size here of the circles based on a value. So I could change it by maybe that new column value I made, right? It's going to update the size of the circles. So that's pretty nice. You can also facet your results by different groupings here. So if I want to break this out, I don't have a great grouping here to use for that, but I can basically make small multiples of my data set. Let me actually just make a quick new data set that actually demonstrate this because I think this is pretty cool. So let's, I'm going to pull in that, do a cell. Actually, I can do it with this one here. Let me just go back here. So one thing I actually didn't mention before. Oh, if you want to get access to the MTA data set, yeah, let me see here. So I can make this notebook accessible. So I will give you guys access to it. Here we go. Now, just to know, if I make it accessible, the private databases won't be accessible. So that's only available to someone on a pro or an enterprise team. Here's a link to that notebook. So she'll be able to access it now. If you want to, you can just grab that file here. So if you go to the File Attachments pane and click Download, you can grab that file and have it run locally. Oh yeah, I think this one broke too because I changed the column names. All right, so before I was talking about data table cell, there's a lot of features in Observable, so sometimes you like forget to mention one. One of the cool things about it is that you can actually convert your data table cell to SQL. So if I want to, I can change this, the kind of drop downs and GUI that I used into a SQL query. So there we go. I've now got, oh, it doesn't work for that column derivation. That should be good feedback for the team. Now, I am running that SQL query that generates that data table cell. So if I want, I can add more custom changes here. So let me just clean up the formatting a little bit. I'm a little specific about how I like to format my SQL queries. So I have to make sure that there's commas before the values. Just for me, it's a little easier to read. So up, and move this down here. More. Okay, so I find that easier to work with. So let me add in another column that I think would work well for faceting the results. So I could do that by maybe something like by year, pretty simple. So I could do like a date trunc function. So it's a common SQL function for extracting the year from my data. So I'll just pull in the date. I'll call this as year name. Here we go. Now I've got the year. Oh, maybe I should do, sorry. I'll do date part. Rather than pulling back a date, I'll pull back the actual, just the year itself. I can just quickly change this to a string if I like. Now, kind of in like a more categorical format, right? So I basically have added a categorical value to my data set. Now I want to use that for my chart down here. So now I'm going to connect to this. I have to name this cell. So let's call this new MTA. Now I'm going to actually just swap this with new MTA. Unfortunately, when you do change your data set, it will just remove the options you had before. So just good thing to note, if you are swapping out the data set, you know, just you're going to lose some of that stuff you had before. Okay, so I've got subways by date over time. I'm going to customize the Y margin again. Okay, and then I can fasten the results, you know, maybe along the Y by year now. And I can make small multiple versions of this. You know, given this by year, since the x-axis is the same, right? It's only going to show the year for that one group. So you get kind of this like split view here. But you could any of those different variables you could fasten the results by. So it works really well for like categorical variables, right? Where you've got a few different categories, you want to see the results by each of those. So yeah, just another cool option for chart cell. So I mentioned before with data table cell, you can eject a code. You can get a SQL query if you want to out of that. For chart cell, you can also eject a code. So if you want to start with chart cell and then you want to start, you know, building it out with code so you can get more expressive and more descriptive and more bespoke, you have that option as well. So underneath the chart cell here, if I click on that, there's this option to convert to JavaScript. So I can click on that, and now I've got just the JavaScript code for running that cell, which is pretty cool. So let me talk a little about this code that comes up here, because this gets into a whole other area we haven't really chatted too much about yet when it comes to data visualization. Actually, we haven't talked about it at all, which is observable plot. So one of our co-founders of Observable, Mike Bostock, is the author of a very popular data visualization framework called D3. And D3 is an incredible framework for building out custom, interactive, animating visualizations. If you haven't seen it before, I'd highly recommend it. So if you go to, I think it's just d3js.org, you can see this beautiful website of all the different types of visualizations you can make. So in Observable, it's really easy to work with D3. It's part of our standard library. You can add it in, and it's, you know, it's incredible. I was a D3 developer for many years, so I love D3. You know, let me pull up one of these examples here. I don't know. We'll just do a simple this chart. This is like a scrollable area chart where you can like scroll over time, right? The thing with D3 though is, as someone who's worked at D3 a lot, it's very powerful, but it's also a little tricky, right? There's a lot to learn with D3. So for a chart like this, which is fairly simple, it's just an area chart, it's got some extra feature where you can kind of scroll and pan around. It's a lot of code. And D3, with all that power and flexibility, you have to really specify everything that you need. So, when you're building a chart, you don't get anything really out of the box. You have to say, all right, I want to build the canvas that I'm working on, which usually is by default SVG, common canvas for web graphics. So you have to add the canvas. You have to add any, HTML containers. You have to add in functions for how to call axes, and you have to add in scales. Like there's just a lot of different things. This one here, actually, a lot of that logic is kind of broken up in different cells. So you can see there's a cell here for defining the x-axis scale, one for the y-axis scale. It's a lot. So really powerful. I love it. I think it's totally worth learning, especially if you're doing custom visualizations on the web. But it can be difficult. It can take some time. And when you're building a very, I think, common chart, some just like a bar chart or a line chart, it's a lot of work for something that maybe there's a simpler way. So the simpler way is Observable Plot. So Observable Plot, and there's a great new website for Observable Plot too. Let me pull up that. There we go. This is our doc site for Observable Plot. It's really nice. Observable Plot is built on top of D3. And the idea of a plot is to give you a lot of the same expressiveness of D3, not all of it, but a lot of it, without the complexity. So you can build that bar chart, with just, 3 or 4 lines of code, while with D3 that might have been 50 lines of code. So you can kind of get up and running quickly with simpler chart forms, your common bar charts, area charts, line charts. You can still customize and get under the hood with JavaScript, but it's not going to be as complex. So, again, I was a D3 developer for many years. When I joined the Observable team, I started learning Plot, and funny, it's like I only work in Plot now because it's really expressive. I would just say the biggest limitations probably of Plot compared to D3 are some of the interactions you can add with D3. Like if you want to get really custom with mouse interactions and hover interactions, D3 is great for that, as well as animations. D3 is incredible for doing custom animations for your visualization. So that's not something we offer in Plot right now. Maybe in the future we'll add that feature in. But yeah, D3 is still a good option for some stuff. Plot site is really fun, and the example library is great. So if you ever want to get inspired and see some really cool data visualizations, I would recommend checking this out. This gallery here has some crazy number, hundreds of different visualizations that you can look at. And for all of these, if you click on one of them, so let's find one. Like, I don't know, this wiggle stream graph. I'm sure you're always trying to figure out how to build a wiggle stream graph. You can pull up this, you can fork this notebook to make a copy for yourself. So you can just start using it for your own data. And again, all the code is available to you underneath. So look at that. Like this is for, a pretty novel chart form, probably pretty hard to build in other frameworks and other tools out there. And it's not that much code, it's just a couple lines. Even some of these things you could get rid of and it would still work, like the label and the grid. So Observable Plot is super cool. And when I work with ChartCell, I can eject my chart to Observable Plot because ChartCell uses Observable Plot to build the chart. We always have that option for you. So you can get under the hood and make those custom changes. Like for example, I'm like, actually, I don't want a tooltip. I want to remove that here. I can just remove that from the code. And then now there's no more tooltip. I realized I kind of glossed over this one too. I've been doing this throughout the whole time. So when you're running a cell, there's that play button there to run the cell. There's also an option below to run the cell. But there's a keyboard shortcut that I use, which is just Shift-Enter. So it's really handy when you're working in cells. Say I want to change the opacity of this stroke for the frame. So I'll just change it to 1. I'm just saying Shift-Enter, and that's how I'm running that cell. So nice little shorthand for that. I can update this margin here, whatever it might be. So, you can get to Observable Plot code kind of for free using ChartCell. You can also get to Observable Plot code on the cell menu here. So if I open up the cell menu again, I talked about all these different options. There's the main kind of cell modes. There's these specialty ones with working with data or tables. And then there's just a bunch of different plot snippets of code that I can pull into a notebook. So if I just want to get the like outline of what a bar chart looks like, or a stacked area chart, I can just get that right away. So let's just pull in one. I don't know. There's a lot in here. Let's do this. I like this one a lot. It's a fun one. It's a density contour. So it's kind of a fun data set. Oh, when you pull in these snippets, it'll just load in some dummy data just so that it's a working code. You can kind of see how it works. So this is one that it just pulls in. It's doing a density contour. So it's actually like, imagine like a scatter plot view. The density contour just tries to show where there's a lot of activity going on in the area. So you can see if there's a lot of overlap where those values are. So let me just swap in my data set here. So I'm going to put in that MTA data. And then we can just change the columns to buses and subways. Now I've got this density contour plot for buses and subways. Margin a little bit. There we go. And with plot, what's really fun is that there's not a limit to how much layers you can do in plot. So right here, I've just got one grouping of marks, which is these this density contour. If I wanted to make this a dot, if I added like a scatter plot in addition to the contours, I can do both at the same time. So let me customize this a little bit. It looks a little crazy. Let's change the fill to the density itself. So you can see the density values are. I can update these circles, maybe make them a little smaller, and maybe make the stroke a little lighter. I don't know, like a light gray. That looks a little crazy. Maybe black was better. Again, I can just start customizing in here. You can override the color scheme if you want to. So I can change the color and say the scheme is not this default rainbow. Maybe just make it something like greens. Greens color scheme. Right. I can start customizing this in a bunch of different ways. So if you want to learn more about plot and how to make those changes, this doc site is going to be the place for you. It's got all the examples and options you can do. So if you want to understand, what was it there? We're just talking about colors. I'm just not sure where is color. I could probably just search for it real quick. Where's color? Oh, it's in scales. So color scales, I can see those options there for like the different types of color scales, right? So great resource if you want to learn more plot. I see an option here. Yeah, observable plot, super cool. I see a question here about GeoJSON. Yeah, so building charts and maps is really easy in notebooks. We've got tons and tons of great examples for working with shapefiles, for building interactive maps. I don't have that on hand at this moment, so I don't know if I want to pull it in. Let me see if I can real quick. Let me just do a little smoke and mirrors. I'm just going to pull another window so you can see all my work. Hold on a second here. Let me see if I can pull one up. All right, so here we go. I'm going to actually add some data to this notebook in a different way I haven't covered yet, which I was going to in a minute, which is imports. So I'm just going to import some data from another notebook. So let me just mention that real quick. So one other fun thing about notebooks is that working in a notebook, each notebook kind of becomes its own mini library. And what that means is you can reuse your notebook in lots of different ways. You can import values from one notebook into another. So here I'm actually importing some data from another notebook. This is from one of our tutorials on how to build maps with observable plot. So plot, you can also build different types of interactive maps. And they've got some data sets here on US power plants. And we've got some shape files around the US and states. So I can draw the actual shape for the states itself. So I can just copy and paste this code here. I can import that data into another notebook. So if you click on that little option here, you'll see here, so these cell options, it has some of the ones we covered already, but there's also an import option. So if it's a name cell, it's got a name to it. I can import that into another notebook. So I'm importing that here. And I can just copy and paste this code. Oh, I forgot to import states. Now I've got like a map I've just added to this notebook. So you can do maps with observable plot. We've got a bunch of options for that. You can also build maps with like really any JavaScript framework. So if you like using D3 for maps, you know D3 is really powerful for maps. You can also use something like 3JS or DeckGL. I've got a bunch of DeckGL examples that are pretty cool. So yeah, lots of different ways you can work with maps in there. Some of those libraries are in our standard library. So like D3 and plot is. If you want to work with GeoJSON files, TopoJSON, that library was built by Mike Bostock as well. That's a way of working with GeoJSON files, and that's part of our standard library. So lots of different ways. I would recommend checking out our Explore page if you want to get up and running and really walk through that to see lots of examples of building maps. So if I go to our Explore page here, I'm just taking a second to load. There we go. We've got a lot of different groupings of examples. They're called collections, which is pretty fun. There's a ton of them. So there's one down here, all for maps. So it's all these examples of maps and all that, like everything I've shown you before. The code is accessible to you, so you can easily just kind of make a copy and swap out with your own data set. Some, I'd say, mind-blowing examples of maps in here. This is one of my favorite ones that tries to show two different types of maps and compare them using animations. So you can see, how you can change the narrative around something like an election map depending on the form in which you draw that map. So they recommend a new type of form, which is using these sort of hex bins rather than doing the sort of traditional, just like filling in the actual full United States, right, with the election results. This create on Observable is amazing. If you've got a couple of minutes, check them out. They've got some just incredible examples of work. So really, really cool. So anyways, yeah, a little bit about maps. Yeah, there's some really, really well done maps on Observable. All right, we've only got a couple more minutes, so I want to just make sure I get through a few more areas. I'm happy to stick around for another little bit afterwards if anyone has any questions. So I talked about, adding data, working with code, working with these different no-code options. Another thing you might want to do is add some interaction to your notebook. So we have a whole framework as well for that, which is called observable inputs. So let me pull up one of these here. So I'm going to do with a kind of a simple example. Well, not a simple chart form, right? This is kind of a more complex one with a density plot and a scatter plot on top. But yeah, give KDO a follow on Observable. Their work is awesome. Say I want to add some interaction to this. So let me think. Maybe I can do a better example with a line chart. I'm going to do a line chart. A new line chart. I'm going to swap my MTA data. It's going to be date and then subways, I believe. There we go. I got my line chart of subway data. Yeah, again, just a little margin. All right, so say I want to add maybe some interaction to this visualization here. By interaction, I mean like ways of like changing the results on the fly. So, this data is very noisy in that it's daily subway ridership levels. So there's a real variation depending on day of week. People mostly ride the subways during the weekdays and less so on the weekends because they use it for work. So it's kind of hard sometimes to see the true trend because there's a lot of noise in there, right? It's going up and down a lot. So we can smooth that out with something like a window function. There's lots of cool functions in plot. One of them allows you to kind of transform your data, so called a window Y. It allows me to basically smooth out my data set. It's a number of units. So here, units are days. So if I say something like the units is 7, it's going to do a rolling week. It's going to smooth it out over a 7-day period. So now I see this rolling week view of my data. Now maybe actually I'll add also in the original so you can see the comparison too. So here is stroke here, it's light gray. Now you can see the kind of original values in light gray and the smoothed out values in this black line. So maybe I want to add an option to a user to change that number of units that we're looking at. They want to like adjust it to see if I should look at a rolling week or a rolling 2 weeks or a rolling month. I can add an input for that and add that interaction to my notebook. So if I search for input, in the cell menu here, I see all the different options for inputs that we offer. And inputs are basically just kind of wrappers around common HTML inputs that you would expect. So buttons, drop downs, radio buttons, sliders, things like that. Maybe for this one, we'll use a slider since we want to kind of adjust this value on a linear scale. So I can make a new slider here. It gives me that little snippet of code when I use the cell menu, uses the inputs library. And for each input, there's some different parameters that it takes. So for a slider, it's going to take a range. So that's the extent of values of my slider. It gives a label, and I can say the steps. So like when I move the slider, how many steps, how many units does it go up? So for this one, let's make the minimum 1. Doesn't make sense to do a rolling 0 day. And I can make the max something like 28 to do a rolling month. And now I've got this slider there. So if I want to use this for my chart, all I got to do is take this variable name, which is called range, and add that to my chart here. So instead of hard coding the value 7, I'm going to just add in this variable. So now when I update this slider here, it's going to update my chart, right? It's going to change the number of units of days I'm looking at for this moving average. Which if you don't use something like 7 or 14, you'll see that noise come back, right? Because it's giving an extra day or one fewer day for that day of week trend. So you'll see 7 works well, and then 14 is going to work well, and then 28 is going to work well as well, right? So units of 7. Anyways, so lots of different ways. You can add multiple different inputs to your chart. So if I looked for something like color, I can add a color input as well. And maybe that is going to change the color of this stroke here. So here we go. Now I'm changing that value. When I update this color, it's going to update immediately. So pretty fun way. All right, we've covered a lot of stuff here today. There's still a lot more to notebooks. So this is sort of the basic stuff that can get you up and running, adding data, manipulating that data, writing some queries or using data table cell, visualizing that data with chart cell and with plot. But let me just for a second, just note some of the things we didn't cover. So, I mentioned before about history pane. There's also other panes here for showing like those imports I talked about. So I can see imports that have been added to my notebook. There's also an insights pane. I can see how much traffic my notebook's getting. If it's getting a lot of views. There's also the ability to collaborate with others in notebooks. So you can add other people to your notebook. You can invite them, and then they can edit alongside with you like you were in like a Google Doc. You can see them kind of live editing in notebooks, which is pretty cool. There's options in here for downloading your code. If you just want to download all of your code, the export options here, you can download your code and have that run locally if you like. There's also options to embed your code into other sites. So if you click on one of these, which has to be a name cell. Sorry, let me go through a different one here. Let's call this, my chart. I have the option to embed my code. I can use it as an iframe on another website, or I can actually run it with React, which is pretty cool. So I can install this with like a React app, something like that. So there's lots and lots more to learn. If you want to keep learning, I would check out our Learn tab at the top of the page. So if you go up here, we've got tutorials, documentation, blog posts, all about how to get running and working in Observable. So check that out. There's also a community Slack channel that we have for people who are working Observable and want to ask questions to the team, and maybe kind of longer form questions, more so than just like a quick note. You should join that. I think Wayne, who's helping out with me today, helping run this workshop, you can put a link in there for the community Slack channel. That's a great resource for that. Yes, there's a keyboard shortcut cheat sheet. If you go to documentation, look up keyboard shortcuts. There you go. You can then pull up all the keyboard shortcuts, and there's many. Lots and lots of stuff there. So lots of new ways to keep learning and reaching out to the team, ask your questions. Hopefully you found this helpful today. It was really fun to walk through kind of all my favorite, observable features in notebooks. Oh, you can see Wayne just joined me in this notebook. His icon has just appeared at the top of the page. So you can see when someone's there with you, which is kind of fun. But yeah, happy to stick around for a few more minutes. You have more questions, but I understand might be busy. You have to hop. Got to go to another call. But thank you so much. Really appreciate it.